Robert had built his technology company from nothing more than a dream and a determination that reminded his late wife Sarah of her father's work ethic back in the old days when handshakes still meant something. The glass towers of downtown reflected the morning sun as Robert sat in his corner office watching his 15 best engineers file into the conference room with expressions that had grown increasingly worried over the past 3 months. They had been working on what should have been a simple problem for their biggest client, but somehow the solution kept slipping through their fingers like sand. Robert remembered how his grandfather used to say that sometimes the hardest problems needed the simplest answers, but these were different times with different challenges. The engineers spread their laptops and tablets across the mahogany table that Sarah had helped him pick out years ago when the company was still small enough to feel like family. Margaret, the lead engineer, cleared her throat and began explaining once again how their software kept freezing whenever users tried to process large batches of data. Her voice carried the weariness of someone who had spent too many late nights staring at lines of code that seemed to mock her efforts. Robert listened patiently as each team member presented their theories and attempted solutions. There was David with his complex algorithms that looked beautiful on paper but somehow never quite worked in practice. Jennifer had redesigned the user interface 3 times, thinking that maybe the problem lay in how people interacted with the system. Even Marcus, who had been coding since before the internet became a household word, admitted he was stumped. The room fell quiet except for the gentle hum of the air conditioning and the distant sounds of the city below. Robert looked around at these brilliant minds who had helped him build something meaningful and felt a familiar weight settle on his shoulders. These people had families to feed, just as he had 8-year-old Emma waiting for him at home, where Mrs. Chen had been taking care of her since Sarah passed 2 years ago. Mrs. Chen had answered his desperate advertisement for a nanny with a handwritten letter that reminded him of thank you notes his mother used to send. She was in her 60s with silver hair always pulled back in a neat bun and hands that seemed to know exactly how to braid Emma's hair or bandage a scraped knee. When she had knocked on his door that first evening, Robert had been struck by something in her eyes that spoke of wisdom earned through decades of caring for others. Emma had taken to her immediately, which surprised Robert since his daughter had been so withdrawn since losing her mother. Mrs. Chen never tried to replace Sarah, but somehow she filled the quiet spaces in their home with her gentle presence and the smell of homemade soup simmering on the stove. She would arrive each morning at 7:30 and have Emma ready for school with braided hair and a lunch packed with the kind of care that only comes from understanding what children really need. In the evenings, when Robert came home exhausted from wrestling with problems that seemed to have no solutions, Mrs. Chen would have dinner ready and Emma's homework spread out on the kitchen table. She never asked for raises or complained about long hours, and when Emma had nightmares, Mrs. Chen would sit beside her bed humming old lullabies until sleep came peacefully. Now, as Robert sat in this conference room surrounded by the best technical minds money could hire, he thought about how Mrs. Chen approached problems differently. She never rushed or raised her voice when Emma spilled juice on her school clothes or forgot to feed the goldfish. Instead, she would pause and think, and somehow always found a way to make things better without making anyone feel foolish. The meeting ended with promises to keep trying, and Robert walked back to his office feeling the familiar knot of worry in his stomach. He picked up his phone and called home to check on Emma as he did every afternoon. Mrs. Chen answered on the second ring with the warm voice that had become as familiar as morning coffee. "Emma is fine," she said. "She finished her homework and we are making cookies for the school bake sale tomorrow." Robert smiled despite his troubles because he knew those cookies would be perfect, and Emma would beam with pride when her classmates asked for seconds. That evening, Robert sat at his kitchen table with his laptop open, trying once more to understand why this particular problem had defeated 15 of the smartest engineers he knew. Mrs. Chen was washing dishes at the sink, humming something that sounded like a half-remembered melody from decades past. Emma was coloring at the other end of the table, occasionally holding up her artwork for approval from both adults. The house felt warm and lived in despite the expensive furniture that Robert sometimes worried made it feel too formal for an 8-year-old. Mrs. Chen finished the dishes and dried her hands on the towel that she always folded in precise thirds. She glanced over at Robert's laptop screen where columns of error messages glowed red against the blue background. Robert had grown accustomed to her quiet observations and the way she could sense when something was troubling him without asking direct questions. She poured herself a cup of tea and sat down across from him while Emma continued her coloring project. "The problem looks very serious," she said in her gentle way that never made anyone feel criticized. Robert nodded and found himself explaining the situation to her as if she were another engineer instead of a woman whose technical knowledge came from a different generation. She listened without interrupting while he described how users would upload their data and the system would work fine for small files but crash whenever someone tried to process anything substantial. Mrs. Chen sipped her tea thoughtfully and asked if she could see what the users saw when they tried to use the system. Robert turned his laptop around and showed her the interface that Jennifer had spent months perfecting. Mrs. Chen studied the screen for perhaps 30 seconds before pointing to a small button in the corner that read Advanced Options. "Do people need to click this?" she asked. Robert explained that yes, most users needed to adjust those settings to handle larger files, but the default settings should work for basic operations. Mrs. Chen nodded slowly and asked if she could try something. Robert watched as she clicked through the interface with the same careful attention she brought to everything else. She found the Advanced Options menu and read through each setting before looking back at him with understanding in her eyes. "The people who need this probably do not know they need this," she said simply. Robert stared at the screen, feeling something shift in his understanding, like tumblers falling into place in an old lock. Of course, users were trying to process large files with settings designed for small ones because they had no way of knowing they needed to change anything. The solution was not more complex code or better algorithms. It was recognizing that people should not have to become experts just to use something that was supposed to make their lives easier. The next morning, Robert gathered his 15 engineers and explained what Mrs. Chen had discovered. They could automatically adjust the settings based on file size rather than expecting users to navigate through advanced menus. The fix took less than a day to implement, and when they tested it, everything worked perfectly. The client was thrilled and the team celebrated with the kind of enthusiasm that reminded Robert why he loved building things that helped people. That evening, Robert came home to find Mrs. Chen and Emma in the kitchen making dinner together. Emma was standing on her usual step stool stirring something that smelled like the comfort foods of his childhood. Mrs. Chen smiled when she saw him and asked how his day had gone. Robert told them about the solution and how sometimes the most complicated problems needed the simplest answers. Emma looked up from her stirring and said that Mrs. Chen always said that when you really listen to people, you can usually figure out what they need. Robert looked at Mrs. Chen, who was quietly setting the table with the same care she brought to everything. He realized that in all the months she had been part of their family, he had never properly thanked her for the way she had helped heal their home. That weekend, Robert asked Mrs. Chen if she would like to stay for dinner instead of leaving after Emma went to bed. She seemed surprised but pleased, and they sat around the kitchen table talking about everything and nothing while Emma showed them both her latest drawings. Mrs. Chen told stories about her own children who were grown now with families of their own, and how being part of Robert and Emma's life had given her a sense of purpose she had not expected to find again. Robert found himself sharing memories of Sarah and how grateful he was that Emma had someone who understood that healing happens slowly and cannot be rushed. As weeks passed, Robert began to understand that the lesson Mrs. Chen had taught him about the software applied to much more than technical problems. When Emma struggled with fractions, Mrs. Chen did not give her more practice sheets but instead had her help measure ingredients for cookies until the concepts made sense naturally. When Robert felt overwhelmed by the demands of running a company while raising a daughter alone, Mrs. Chen reminded him that some days were for solving problems and other days were for making sure Emma knew she was loved. The business continued to grow, and Robert made sure that Mrs. Chen received a bonus that reflected how much her wisdom had contributed to their success. But more importantly, he began to approach challenges with the same patient observation she had shown him. Instead of assuming people needed to adapt to his company's technology, he started asking how the technology could better serve the people who used it. The 15 engineers began incorporating this philosophy into all their projects and discovered that the most elegant solutions usually came from truly understanding what users were trying to accomplish. Years later, when Emma was older and Mrs. Chen had become like a grandmother to her, Robert would remember that evening when 30 seconds of careful attention had solved what months of brilliant analysis could not. He learned that sometimes the people closest to everyday life see things that experts miss. And that the greatest innovations often come not from adding complexity but from removing the barriers that keep people from getting what they really need. Mrs. Chen continued to be part of their family, bringing her quiet wisdom to problems both technical and personal. She taught them both that kindness and careful attention could solve more problems than all the advanced degrees and sophisticated tools in the world. And in the warmth of their kitchen, where cookies baked and homework got done and 3 people who had found each other created something like home, Robert understood that the best solutions always come from remembering that behind every problem there are real people just trying to make their lives a little bit better.